Hello, this is Patrick Kennedy, here with some commentary and insights into our production of ZOMBOID by Richard Foreman, which played at the New Wimbledon Theatre in December 2019. ZOMBOID is a multimedia theatre piece incorporating an hour-long filmed tableau vivant, which played on two screens, which you can see there, one stage left and one on the rear theatre wall. And there are 5 actors on stage throughout the hour interacting with the tableau vivant on both screens. We filmed the film sequence in September last year before rehearsals started, as it was imperative that I was able to edit and complete the film section before we started rehearsal. Obviously, because without the film, it's really difficult for the actors to know what they're taking their cues from, and what the shape of the piece is. So I spent a good couple of months right through until the very first rehearsal, editing the film together and creating the soundscape which accompanies the film. The soundscape is pretty much devised from scratch using samples and loops. In Richard's original production in 2006 in New York, the actors on screen were different to the actors who were on stage, but for our production we used a combination. We had all 5 actors from the stage production in the film and an additional 2 actors on screen who don't appear on stage. The film is in black and white to give a heavy contrast to the bursts of colour which were on stage, which are not that clear through this filmed version because of the bleaching out of the lighting. But it was predominantly greens, reds, pinks and whites, complementing the rather glamorous costumes that the actors were wearing, which were matador outfits. On screen, the costumes are much simpler. We went for a kind of militia look for the actors and had them all wearing blacks, so black t-shirts, black trousers, black shoes, with a burst of colour with red armbands, which are occasionally visible in the film. And in addition to that, they each wore necklaces which had the character initial that they would be playing on stage. The recording of the film was fairly straightforward. I'm not a great editor or filmmaker myself, but I certainly turned my hand to it out of necessity, and added some really straightforward, simple overlays and titles. So the show opens with the 5 performers entering the stage rather trepidatiously, as if they know this world and it's a dangerous world that they inhabit, and that they are careful about every step and move they make. And that nervous tension was something in rehearsals that we discussed from the beginning. There was no narrative arc or relationships that we built between the characters in rehearsals. It was very much they move where I asked them to in a certain way that I asked them to throughout the first few weeks of rehearsals. So it was very much blocking in the traditional sense. But obviously in traditional theatre, blocking then moves on to character development, backstories, all that sort of traditional theatre stuff. We never advanced beyond that. really. We just stuck to the unknown, and the unknown in this piece is what ties everything together. Certainly by the end of the production, we all had further insights into who we thought these people were and what we thought they were up to, which I'll share a little bit later. And you might start to see those connections. For the audience, I wanted them to be overwhelmed by, as with every production I do, by a cacophony of sound, stage visuals, props, lighting, and in this case, the extra additional element of film. And I presumed that audiences, if they wanted to invest themselves in the show, would immediately try to build connections between what they were seeing on screen and what was happening on stage. So there were tropes which were copied across from the film to the stage. So as you can see there, one of the actors has been blindfolded, and on screen another actor, in fact 3 actors are blindfolded. And I wanted audiences this early on to start to try to make connections between what they were seeing on stage and what they were seeing on film. Essentially, the stage work throughout the whole piece is tableau. So using props and furniture and set pieces, the actors would move into positions which look almost painterly, and I could manipulate that painterly image myself by the controlling of the lights. In this production, for the first time, I retained control over each individual light, so nothing was programmed, and I was able to be at the desk controlling the lights each night and changing them according to my mood and my instincts. So each night the lighting was quite different as I manipulated the audiences. And that manipulation is really, I guess it's part of the artistic process from my perspective of trying to show some autonomy myself over what the audience are seeing, rather than it being created and repeated night after night in the same way. By this additional element, on my part at least, I was able to change the focus of each tableau depending on how I was feeling about it. And similarly for the actors, it meant that they were having new experiences each night with these lighting changes. In terms of how the actors were taking their cues, it was an enormous achievement in concentration on their part, in being absolutely in tune with both the soundtrack and the visuals on screen, as it alternated between those two things for their cues. So occasionally it would be an on-screen cue they were waiting for, so they have to have an eye on a part of the screen, or it's a sound cue reliant on timing, such as this section, where the actors are internally counting the beats between the gaps in the sound in preparation for their next move. It was quite a difficult process, especially I guess for the actors, because I kept changing the sound effects as we went on and making slight adjustments, so they were very patient to allow me that range in adapting the sound. And in rehearsals that's often the case. Day one we start in a certain place, and by dress rehearsal it's often changed completely occasionally, as further impulses and further insights into the piece appear. And I welcome contributions from the actors too in rehearsals, of course, to make recommendations about adjustments and shifts And so that happened throughout the whole process, even up to the dress rehearsal. The stage space is fairly simple in this production. There are 3 partitions at the sides, which kind of represent pens or horse stables, bolting out of the stable and charging into the race. There are 3 TVs that you see throughout the film on there at the back, which just produce white noise on screen and in sound. And they are almost portals into a different world. If these 5 people were trapped inside this space, they're like windows to the outside world. And I thought it was quite a nice visual effect. Again, that was a change fairly late on. We were going for light boxes up until about 3 or 4 days before the final rehearsals, and then we swapped it out to televisions. And the TVs, they represent escape from this world. In terms of the other elements of props and furniture, it's playground-esque. So there's lots of toys, lots of letterboxes, a cube, what are they called? Cubes with letters on. So it's infantile, and that this group of people are inhabiting this playground space. Again, there's the mirroring of the film image and the stage image here, as the film characters look out into the outside world. Physically, there's quite a lot of push and pull between the characters. Here, for example, which is, again, a variation on playground behaviour and playground activity. And this is eventually where, narratively, I ended up, and it certainly wasn't part of the thought process in rehearsals, that potentially we have 2 parents here, the 2 who are pointing at one another. That's Davey and Georgia. He sees more pointing. That these 2 characters were the parents, so the mother and the father, and the 3 lads were their children. And there is some kind of familial history being played out in front of us. I came to the conclusion that the father figure had been either mentally or physically abusive towards the mother and subsequently the children, and that the children have this archetypal fear of the father figure, and that informs their behaviour throughout the piece. But as I say, that wasn't part of the process when we rehearsals. It was just as I was watching it night after night and making these connections myself in much more detail. I think that's the conclusion I ended up. Whether that was an unconscious influence in the piece coming from a divorced family, albeit not mentally or physically abusive, but those elements were playing in perhaps to my interpretation of what was happening on stage. Once the soundtrack and the film were complete, it was then about building all of these props which didn't exist or I couldn't hire, which put to test my ability to do any kind of woodworking or drilling or measuring. Not a natural skill of mine, but it was certainly a great learning experience in trying to build these objects from scratch in a way which fitted into the world that we'd created. So this kind of trolley throne was made fairly simply from 4 doweled long dowels of wood. I think it's called a dowel, dowel of wood, and a platform and some caster wheels on the bottom, and polystyrene, lots of polystyrene balls which I painted this kind of crimson red on top of the throne, and those balls are in various different places on the set. You can see two there on the mystical object. So yeah, the building of the props was really time consuming and really frustrating, but I was quite pleased with how they turned out in the end. And as with all of these productions, it always does come together for the actors and for myself when you're actually in the space. And I know that's the case for most theatre productions too, but here, we were rehearsing without that throne trolley, without the chair they would be using, without the shelves, without the two screens. So actually, during rehearsals, the actors just had to refer to my laptop turned around because we didn't have the technology in rehearsals to display it any bigger than that. They didn't have the partitions, so it was really an exercise in imagination for the actors during rehearsals. And then when you get into the space and you see everything in place, it suddenly makes sense for the actors who've been rehearsing it for 10 or 12 weeks. It finally makes sense a bit more. So in my interpretation of what was going on, so here's the father on the left, one of the sons on the right, and the intermediary son, which we kind of came up with for George, who's at the back there, who doesn't seem to have the same fear as the other two siblings, if we'll call them that, and intercepts and intercedes quite a lot throughout the piece as this kind of mediator. I recorded all of the voiceovers and just manipulated those using various effects on Audacity. Suppose I were to postulate, which was quite fun. The lamps, again, they weren't part of the original design until we got into the space, and actually a previous show that had been in just before us had left them behind, and so our technician at the theatre said we could either get rid of them or keep them, and actually they became such an integral part of the visual landscape for the final production. It was just fortuitous that they were there, and I think they had a really fantastic effect on bringing the height of the theatre down and boxing in the actors somewhat more than if they weren't there. Why not? Please take. So again, in a normal world, this sense of ridiculous, two stuffed donkeys, a really giant, squishy strawberry toy guns that Davey's got at the back, these, over-the-top costumes. It's almost like a children's party, and that's certainly the environment we were trying to build. Very, very little is said by any of the actors. In fact, if my memory serves me correctly, the only person who speaks... no, they all speak, forgive me. Everybody has a line, but they're few and far between. You'll hear them. The flow here between these tableaus that are being built was really key. That nothing looked rushed, that nothing looked accidental, that everything that was happening was already thought out and pre-planned by these characters before they entered the room. Nothing from them is impulsive. and you can't see that, but the book that he's reading is the Red Book by Jung, tying in some archetypal analysis into the piece. The grandfather clock, the face on the clock is Richard Foreman, and inside the body of the clock is a doll, which was actually a reference back to Paint, which was the first of the 3 Foreman productions I did in 2019. And that doll and the cloud on which she's sat was placed over the top of the stage and kind of became the overseer of the action on stage. And in this production, it's been taken back inside the body of Richard Foreman and lives within him now. The lights you see there where it becomes more bleached out is when the audience were lit brightly by the seating floodlights, so it would temporarily blind them to what was happening on stage, and then by the time the lights have gone off, their eyes are having to force themselves to be readjusted back to what was happening on stage.
Well.
So we've quickly returned to this playground chant, playground dance behaviour, and retaining that youthful energy on the stage. Whereas on screen there's very adult conversations going on, and that you can't really see now, but there is a table around which the family are sat and discussing matters. So there's a contrast between the on-screen film, which has more seriousness, more weight to it, whereas the on-stage behaviour is more playful, like this, for example. You shove your Jungian psychoanalysis up your ass.
Take off the blinders.
The voiceover is often repeating short aphorisms, short beautiful phrases. Suppose I were to postulate is a recurring aphorism throughout the piece, both by the voiceover in the theatre auditorium and also uttered by the on-screen actors, who... There's another. If you were to postulate... So it's usually, if I were to postulate something, 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 I would have to deal with that. And that was the recurring aphorism throughout the piece.
If you were to postulate, this is different, this is different. I would have to do it.
Often with these pieces, the audience doesn't know how they're supposed to react to what they're seeing. Every audience member comes in with, if they haven't seen a Foreman play before, with a certain expectation about what theatre is and what it should look like, and the structure it should follow. And in every way, really, these productions confound those expectations. They stop audience members from sitting in catharsis and frustrate that expectation constantly by interrupting those expectations. They're trying to build connections between characters all the time and trying to figure out, well, this must mean something. You know, why is this not fitting together? Who are these people? Why is that donkey being rocked on that supine body? What's going on? And actually, that's you're not going to win that argument with yourself, and that's part of the aesthetic of the piece and the philosophy behind Foreman's work. That not acquiescing to audience expectations about what theatre should be is the main goal. So often, whenever we were in rehearsals and started to think this has started to become narratively comprehensible, we would shift slightly and add in a ridiculous element, like this, for example, a potato on a sword being rubbed on the head of a matador. At once it's confusing, it's ridiculous, it's you know, it's not a high art form, but it still confounds audience members in terms of how they're expected to react. They think, am I supposed to laugh at this? Am I missing the high art here? Am I not intelligent enough to interpret what's going on here? Are the cast and the director so pretentious that they're mocking us and our lack of knowledge? And it's none of those things. The fundamentals of all of my work in theatre for the past 6 years has been about a return to playfulness, to surrealism, to the ridiculous, and from that surrealist perspective, you as an audience member are able to draw, or not if you don't want to, your own conclusions about what's going on stage and what the meaning is and what I'm trying to say. And some audiences don't like to do that. And I always think of my shows, my recent shows, as kind of like visiting a gallery where in the art world you don't often go in with a set of expectations, or maybe you do. Maybe you go to see a exhibition billed as a surrealist exhibition or a impressionist exhibition, and you go in knowing fundamentally what it is you're going to be getting from that exhibition, and you either like it or you don't like it. You ask questions about it, you research about the artist and where they were coming from and the historical and social context of the piece, but with theatre that doesn't tend to happen because of catharsis. You expect to come in and be able to piece together what's going on, and that's your right as an audience member in theatre. And I guess my shows are trying to contradict that assumption. But as I say, the reactions, if you want to laugh, laugh. If you want to be frustrated, be frustrated. If you want to walk out, walk out. And people did and do walk out of these shows, even though they're not very long. They're only maximum about an hour. But often after 20 minutes, people just can't. They're so assaulted by a range of sounds and visuals and lights that they just can't cope anymore and have to leave. And I do I do make the cast aware of this from the very beginning, from actually through the auditions, that this is probably going to be unlike anything they've ever rehearsed before, that it will be frustrating, that they have to trust the process, and that the process will generate a feasible and enjoyable, I hope, outcome. And that actually, when you're in the mire of the first few weeks of rehearsals and you've got no idea what's going on, I'm not giving you much free range in terms of what you can do physically. I'm quite strict with what I want at first. But eventually things start to ease up. Once the shape of the piece exists, then we start talking in a bit more detail physically about the emotions and ideas that we want to be putting across. And those adjustments, as I said earlier, go throughout the rehearsal process right through until opening. None of this is, I would like to highlight, is none of it is random. It's similarly with the video content and the aphoristic phrases, there is repetition. In the visuals of the film, there is repetition. On stage, there is physical repetition in terms of where people are going, bringing objects on, bringing objects off. There's a repeated use of physical architecture. And similarly with the sound effects over the top, there are repeated sound effects. So it allows the audience to have an impression that there is a full architecture to the piece, that nothing is just made up. It's not a, no disrespect, but it's not just an A-level piece where people are randomly doing whatever they want to do with no forethought. It's just trying to be random for random's sake. There is an architecture to the piece, which from my perspective is fairly instinctive. I don't plot out the piece in advance. A lot of it's done in the room. And naturally these repetitions come up, which help to shape the piece into something which resembles a form. So there's the variation really in terms of repetition. We've already mentioned the playground theme as being one of the variations physically and visually, but also the sense of fear and uncertainty that comes across repeatedly throughout the show. Each character is uncertain or fearful of something in some way, most of the time, if not all the time. And so that's another piece of the architecture which helps an audience to grasp concepts. There is Richard Foreman wrote a long introduction to his original production, which is quite an interesting read from his original production, which goes into quite a lot of detail about the donkey, the fact that this was influenced in some way by the photos that were released from the abuse of prisoners in Iraq. The blindfolds being his main focus. So it's quite an interesting article to read if you want to look on his website. We moved away from that and wanted to build our own world and interpretation of the script. And the script is quite a mountain to get through. There are several columns. There's a column for the timestamp, so that the stage action is timed to the timestamp of the film. There are sound cues, there are stage directions, there's text, spoken text. And picking that apart as a director is exciting and challenging because we removed most of the stage directions and timestamps and just created our own world. But by the end of the piece, of course, you still have to go back to those timestamps and make sure that everything is very rigid and timed correctly. So it was really interesting picking apart the script and then putting it back together with our own interpretation. I think that might be the first spoken word we've had from the actors, and we're 35 minutes into the piece. And George's character is always pulled in to these TVs, these windows to the outside world. He's always got an eye on the TVs, as if there's some kind of calling from them towards him. And again, that's that repetition throughout the piece. So we start to get the idea that something's up with those TVs and something's up with George. You wouldn't guess in a month of Sundays how difficult it is to blindfold somebody accurately from behind. It took quite a lot of effort on the part of the actors to get that right, and it was really difficult for me to offer any kind of help or advice on how to do it accurately. It was more about just doing it and finding a way to sort it out. But it was really tough. Of all the things in this show, blindfolding people from behind was probably the toughest part. A bit about the costumes. So, or the makeup. So the actors have removed their eyebrows pretty much, and have heavy red eye makeup, totally unnaturalistic eye makeup on, which was again to help tie in the theme of fear, that maybe these guys haven't slept in a very long time. They rub their eyes a lot, causing the skin to become sore and ruptured, because they're always fearful. They're always anticipating something, so that they don't sleep, and they rub their eyes to keep awake. And the loss of the eyebrows, it was part of a thought of mine that either it was a nervous reaction from their fear, that they would pluck their eyebrows. I once was working with an actress who had a tendency to pull out her eyebrows whenever she was anxious. So there was part of that playing into that idea, but also that they look very much otherworldly when they don't have eyebrows, that they could be existing on a different planet, that this is a totally different realm that they're inhabiting. So there's a kind of double thought process that went into the eyebrows there. You see there my terrible paintings of two donkeys, one of which, the one on the right, looks extremely misshapen. But again, it's a playground, it's a school, it's art, it's kids making art, so I could get away with that. That's how I justify it to myself anyway. The actors were asked to look out as much as possible, but as if it was a blank wall. They're not looking at the audience and intimidating them or trying to entice them into watching the show or in any way interact with them. It was much more about the kind of World War I stare of just looking into oblivion. Even when they look at one another, there's that kind of long stare, no emotion, no compassion, no empathy, nothing. So here's a good example of where the actors are multitasking massively by performing the stage action as well as counting in their head the time between the last sound effect and the next one. There's no indication about when that sound effect is going to come back in, so they have to count and be really, really rigid in their movements to make sure that they're not either going too slowly or going too quickly. So George keeps turning on these TVs, incurring the wrath and disappointment of the mother and the two siblings here. The mother is confiscating the beloved donkey of George to stop him playing with it. That's his punishment. And George expresses his frustration at these forms of punishment and disappointment by physically hurting himself. Again, that's repeated a couple of times throughout the piece too. That eyeball was probably the most difficult thing to make. Again, with a limited budget, not being able to afford a proper mould or fiberglass or anything like that, we had to think more creatively. So I spent about 4 weeks making it. Inside is a exercise ball and papier-mâché, about 5 or 6 different layers of papier-mâché to make sure that it would never crack, and then several layers of paint and a special varnish on top to make sure that it wouldn't pick up dirt, or if it did you could just wipe it off, and that there was some kind of security to the shape of the eye. It lasted about the whole week before it started to fall apart, so we were quite lucky. During one of the performances it got accidentally dropped and it created a crack in the papier-mâché, but we just managed to cover it up with a bit of white tape and nobody ever knew. But I was quite pleased with how it turned out. This is a great, again, another testament to the actor's timing. Davey here having to count fairly random beats in his drumming of the inevitable donkey fun sign. Again, it was about making sure that it looks sharp and it looks clean, so that we don't look under-rehearsed or that it's totally random. So he does a really good job with the counts. So we've introduced some more infantile objects here with the doll and the doll's house. A doll which is totally oversized and would never fit in the doll's house. The doll's outgrown the household. And we'll see that mirrored in a moment with George mounting his father, who's folded into the shape of the roof of the house, and George gets on top, as do the other siblings. So it's a kind of mirror of that child outgrowing the home. So the tableau on stage here is a reflection of the tableau that was on screen earlier, which I think has changed over now. But on screen we saw the same tableau.
Tell you. 3. Those predisposed to happiness see nothing.
You see the donkey on screen there now that I was referring to. This is George's first time in the trolley throne. His brother was in there earlier, but this is his first time in there, and there's a sense that it's almost like a naughty step. It's a place you go to when you've been misbehaving, and that in this environment in which he finds himself, he's become an outcast in his own family. He's staring into the doll's house, the oversized doll outgrowing the confines of the house, having toys taken away, playing with the TVs, and now he's receiving punishments, of which this is one. And each of these long pauses is based on a kind of formalized painting that you could be looking at and studying in a gallery and trying to unpick what's going on here. Has George painted those donkeys? Has he damaged those paintings and his brother is chastising him and his misbehaviour? Whatever interpretation it is you want to put to it, but that's why we give enough time for the audience to take in the stage picture and try to build their own interpretation. It's all of these elements of the picture landscape slowly coming together like a jigsaw, and then it exists for a few moments and then it evaporates again, and then another one is created and then it evaporates again. Again, here we're trying to give clues and hints about relationships between them, even though in rehearsal we hadn't decided what those relationships were. It kept the actors guessing internally each time they performed about exactly what was going on, and that freedom to make those adjustments themselves is really interesting for me to watch. Again, there's an intimation here that George has done something wrong and has been returned to his naughty chair. The father is injured or damaged by his behaviour, or by a revelation potentially that George has found something out about the father, and the father has collapsed in with anxiety about what's been discovered. The eye representing the knowledge and understanding of a situation that now weighs heavily on the body of the father. The two children saying, "Be quiet, keep it a secret. There's no need to talk about it." And so George ceremoniously destroys his insight into adult relationships, but the relationship between his mother and father. Doesn't want that insight anymore, wants to be free of it. On screen we've got the George and his mother waving the American flag. The American flag has been in all of the Foreman plays that I've produced as a cultural reference. The projectors had an interesting effect on the eye, in that when it was held aloft, the videos you can see there projected onto the eye, as if it was absorbing the on-screen action, filling itself with that knowledge and information, which I thought was quite a nice effect.
Runs with it and does hard, impossible things.
At every moment on stage, the actors were asked to be doing something, so we devised various things. So you see George there in the top right-hand corner, rubbing the target on the ass of the donkey. You've got all of the other actors having a procession towards the television to look out of that window. So at all times, the actors had an action to perform. Nothing was paused or static for lack of things to do. There was always something going on, so that the audience was able to look at any point of the stage at any time and take it in. So if you were bored of watching the eye, or if you're bored of watching the film, or bored of listening to the soundtrack, you could glance across the stage and there's always something else to look at. A constant renewal of impulses on stage for them to look at. The behaviour of George's character throughout the piece, in contrast to his siblings, is one of a lack of discipline, of breaking outside of expectations of how he should behave. He's misbehaving. The other siblings have self-control and are therefore more loved potentially to the parents, or at least noticed less by the parents, and being noticed by the parents in this situation seems to be a negative thing with negative consequences. George is singing here about the donkey, comparing himself with the donkey that we've had on stage, and saying that one of them is a prisoner and one of them is free. An inanimate object such as a donkey you would think is prisoner because it doesn't have the free will to leave the environment in which it finds itself, because obviously it's inanimate and not real. And George is the opposite of that and has free will and choice. But the suggestion here is that he is being imprisoned by this group of people. Because the donkeys have gone, actually. On screen, George is supine and the family are gathered round. This was a hint towards the Iraq War, a nod towards a soldier being killed.
Expirez, 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 expirez.
Every object that's starting to appear now is a building block of knowledge for George's character to understand how he can escape the environment in which he finds himself and the environment which he doesn't like. So now more and more objects are introduced to try to help him make that escape, and they're normally introduced by the mother or the two siblings, and the father is trying to put stumbling blocks in George's way to trap him. So I think here the table's slightly turned narratively for me instinctively, in that I wanted the mother and siblings to start to help the younger brother find a way out of this nightmarish situation without getting the attention of the father and risking their own safety and livelihoods. The throne trolley here, the naughty step, has become a kind of private chamber for the father, who is berating the acquisition of knowledge of the children. He's mocking them, and it's almost a transmutation even into the donkey. So his voice, we worked in rehearsals on making him sound more and more like a hee-hawing donkey. So you can imagine this father going down to a shed or a cupboard or a room in the house and locking himself away and getting at the fury he's feeling about his disobedient children, learning knowledge and learning about the world and figuring out that there is an escape out of this environment in which they find themselves.
The sun is shining.
George is trying to find his escape, crawling away without getting the attention of anybody in the room. And this is really where the denouement of the piece begins.
A lifetime is an accurate diagnosis. 1, 2,
Where we realise that the father is targeting his son. You see that here, the target on his hand, which then zooms into the head of George as he's made the decision to get rid of him permanently.
well, well.
And the eye of knowledge of everything that's been seen now weighs heavy on George in his naughty step, as he tries to figure out how he's going to make his final escape now that the father has turned his attentions to eviscerating his existence rather than just bullying him. And of course I'm talking narratively about this piece now, and a reminder that that wasn't part of the rehearsal process, and it wasn't part of my thought process when putting the piece together. It's something that's come about afterwards, as I started to analyse my own stage pictures and the way in which they're put together, and how they're presented, and the focus that I've put on each scene. That afterwards I've come up with this narrative. So I appreciate that for most people watching it, it's completely alien to them at first glance. But the more work you put into it, like any stage picture, like any artist picture, the more work and more study you put into it, the more you get out of it. The death of Richard Foreman's ideas in the piece was represented there by Davey opening up the clock face of Richard and removing his skull. eradicating this very British production of the American values of which it was written.
Strangers are not.
And I guess that's because I was, at this point, wandering quite far off the text that Richard had put in his stage directions, and then I was saying we're now moving into we've moved the piece away from his original ideas. So the idea of this stage picture here is that the two children and the father figure have their regular weekly music classes in a separate room somewhere in this house, and they're waiting for George to turn up to join in the weekly session as he normally would. And George, almost like he's wearing an invisible cloak, approaches this fearful father figure, and has started to understand he has some invisibility. They can't see him, but suddenly they do. They lift their blindfolds and they see him. And out of fear and instinct, he puts on his own blindfold so that he becomes blind himself, blind to the situation and to the dangers. And by blindfolding himself to his immediate surroundings and dangers, he loses the fear and the trepidation of the consequences of his actions. By being blindfolded, he becomes more confident and can find his way out of the situation. The mother comes running in and realizes that her son has gone. And we have this fairly long sequence now with George tiptoeing around the house blindfolded, feeling his way out of the room, dismissing objects that previously stopped him from progressing out of the room and out of the house and the environment. So there's references here to objects that were used throughout the piece, the lettered building blocks, the pictures of Richard Foreman, and a variety of other pieces. The one thing he does pick up which is new is a Rubik's Cube, which is actually a Sudoku Rubik's Cube. So that repetition of letters and numbers and figuring out a way. Although he's blindfolded, he's feeling his way to the solution, to the unlocking of the key to escape the space. The family is still waiting. Where is he? What's taking him so long? Little do they know that he's making his way out and making his escape.
That beast of the inevitable.
As he covers the Rubik's Cube, there's an idea that this door has opened, this window has opened, and the escape is imminent. And the father has heard that and figured it out and is wailing in agony at the loss of his son. And on screen we had the title overlay, Carl, which was George's character's name. Carl is going to Potato Land, which again is a reference to the other two pieces that I did. Potato Land seems to be this destination to which the onstage characters want to get to. So, I don't know if it's a good place or it's a bad place or it's death, but it's where inevitably at least one of the characters ends up in each show. So the conclusion of the piece is based around the two children seeing their sibling escaping the environment as they prepare to play their instruments to a soundtrack of rather melancholic trumpet being played, building an atmosphere of melancholy. And of course, instead of playing the guitars, they have scrolls, which you can see hanging off the guitars there, which they unravel, which I, again, retrospectively think may have been goodbye notes to each of the characters from Carl, George's character, that he's written these notes and attached them to the instruments, knowing that they're going to read them and that they can get some understanding about his motivations for leaving. And this was really beautifully played as the mother collapses to the floor in realization that I think in joy that Carl has escaped this oppressive and dangerous environment, and doesn't show up on screen, but she often cried during this sequence, which is beautiful. A single tear would run down her cheek in relief as she now comes to terms with life without her son. And now you can't really see that on screen, but George was pulling a long piece of material as if he was climbing up the wall and going over the side of the wall and escaping into the world. The film closes on screen with a close-up of Richard Foreman from one of his previous productions in the 80s. So the events of the evening have exhausted all of the actors, and they collapse down onto their guitars and onto the floor to rest, to nap, to recuperate. And George, having climbed and freed himself, is equally exhausted. We left it as fairly open as to whether he did survive or whether he actually didn't make it, and that he's passed away rather than fallen asleep like the others. And that is the end of the play. It slowly fades to black as the film concludes. So I hope you've enjoyed listening in and getting some insights into the play and into the thought process that went behind it and that has developed since it's been on stage. Thanks to the cast, who were phenomenal, who had such a difficult job with this piece, but it just was so great to work with, and full of so many great ideas, which made the whole piece come to life. So thanks to them, and thanks to you for watching, and I hope to see you sometime in the near future with another production.